My father sent me a text message demanding $15,000 to cover the remaining balance for my sister Jasmine's wedding catering, threatening to completely cut off my college tuition if I refused. He had absolutely no idea that I had graduated as valedictorian of my class over a decade ago, or that I currently earned more in a single month than he and my mother made in an entire year. He also did not know that by the end of this lavish wedding weekend, I would completely own his new son-in-law's entire corporate career. Before I tell you how I turned their perfect day of social climbing into the ultimate reality check, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to hide your success just to protect your peace from a toxic family. The morning. The message arrived. I was standing in the kitchen of my downtown Chicago penthouse watching the sunrise reflect off the waters of Lake Michigan. I had just finished grinding beans for my espresso machine when my phone vibrated against the cool marble countertop. I picked it up expecting an update from my acquisitions team. Instead, the screen illuminated with a message from Calvin, my father. The text read exactly like this. You will pay the $15,000 remaining balance for Jasmine's wedding catering by tomorrow, or I am cutting off your college tuition immediately. Do not embarrass this family. I stood there in my silk robe surrounded by millions of dollars in real estate that I had purchased with cash, and I simply laughed. It was not a bitter laugh, but a deep, genuine sound of pure amusement that echoed through the high ceilings of my apartment. The sheer delusion of his threat was staggering. My father actually believed he held the keys to my survival. He believed that the $200 he occasionally transferred to my account every few months gave him the right to claim he was entirely funding my non-existent education. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich flavor and the absolute silence of my home. My life was peaceful, secure, and completely unbothered by financial anxiety. The threat to cut off my tuition was as hollow as my family's public image, but Calvin did not know that yet. To understand why a 35-year-old woman would let her family believe she was still a broke, struggling college student, you have to understand the dynamic of my household and the cultural weight of the black tax. In many African American families, there is an unspoken, suffocating expectation that the moment you achieve any level of financial success, you instantly become the designated bank for your entire bloodline. If I had ever revealed my true income, my mother Brenda would have immediately demanded a new house in the suburbs to show off to her church friends. My father would have expected me to fund his endless string of failed business ventures so he could play the big shot at the golf course. And Jasmine, my younger sister by 5 years, would have expected her lifestyle to be fully subsidized by my bank account. Jasmine was the undisputed golden child. She was loud, fiercely competitive, and perfectly molded to fit my parents' obsession with social status. While she chased after wealthy men and focused on curating a flawless social media presence, I was the quiet observer. Early on, I realized that the only way to protect my sanity and my future wealth was to become completely invisible to their greed. So I crafted a persona. I became the perpetual student. I let them believe I was constantly changing my major, drifting aimlessly from art history to sociology to communications, unable to figure out my life. It was a brilliant shield. Because they viewed me as a struggling disappointment, they never asked me for large sums of money, and they mostly left me alone. They used me as the family cautionary tale, a convenient punching bag to make themselves feel superior. The reality was vastly different. I had attended Howard University on a full academic scholarship, working multiple side hustles to cover my living expenses. I graduated at the top of my class with a degree in data science long before data analytics became the massive industry it is today. While my family mocked me at Thanksgiving dinners for still finding my way, I was quietly building a data analytics firm from the ground up. I spent my 20s grinding through sleepless nights, securing corporate contracts and developing proprietary algorithms that eventually caught the attention of Fortune 500 companies. 10 years later, I was the sole founder and CEO of a firm that was generating 8 figures annually. I was completely self-made, and I did it all while letting Calvin loudly complain to his friends about the burden of paying for my endless education. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, looking down at the city streets coming alive below. My phone buzzed again, breaking my train of thought. It was a barrage of voicemails this time. I walked over to the kitchen island, hit the speakerphone icon, and listened as my mother's voice filled the room. Brenda's tone was dripping with that specific brand of passive-aggressive sweetness she used when she wanted to manipulate a situation. "Kiara," she began, sighing heavily into the receiver. "I know your father already texted you, but you need to understand the pressure we are under. Jasmine is marrying Wyatt, and his family comes from very good, wealthy stock. They have certain expectations for this wedding. We cannot afford to look like a charity case in front of his parents. We have already stretched our budget to the limit, and you have been hoarding whatever little money you make from your part-time jobs for years. It is time for you to step up and be a supportive sister. Do not be selfish. Call your father back and arrange the transfer." The voicemail ended immediately, followed by the next one. This time it was Jasmine. Her voice was shrill, lacking any of the fake diplomacy my mother attempted. "Kiara, listen to me carefully. The floral arrangements for the reception are looking incredibly sparse, and the catering company is threatening to pull our upgraded menu if the final deposit is not paid by tomorrow morning. I am not having my perfect day ruined because you want to be stubborn. Empty out your little savings account and wire the money to Dad. It is not like you are spending it on anything important anyway. Another useless semester of classes can wait. This is my wedding. Fix it." I let the recording end the silence, rushing back into my kitchen. They were panicking. Wyatt was a white corporate middle manager who came from a family of inherited wealth. From the moment Jasmine brought him home, Calvin and Brenda had been bending over backwards to impress him and his relatives. They were bleeding their own retirement accounts dry to fund a lavish, over-the-top wedding just to prove they belonged in Wyatt's social stratosphere. Now the bills were catching up to them, and in their desperation, they were trying to squeeze water from a stone, or rather from the daughter they assumed was a stone. I picked up my coffee and walked down the hallway into my home office. The room was sleek and modern, equipped with a massive mahogany desk and an array of high-resolution monitors. I sat down in my leather executive chair and woke up my computer screens. I opened my primary dashboard, logging into my company's secure financial portal. The numbers loaded instantly. Our quarterly projections were phenomenal, sitting comfortably in the 8-figure range. We had just secured another massive government contract, and my personal investment portfolio was yielding returns that my father could not even fathom in his wildest dreams. I looked at the glowing numbers on the screen and then glanced at my phone. The $15,000 they were demanding was literal pocket change to me. I could have wired it without even noticing a dip in my daily interest accumulation. But this was not about money. This was about respect, boundaries, and a lifetime of emotional manipulation. I closed my laptop and made my decision. I was not going to send them a single dime, but I was also not going to block their numbers and skip the wedding. No, that would be far too easy. I had spent 10 years playing the role of the broke, directionless sister, absorbing their insults and microaggressions so they could feel better about their own insecure lives. I owed it to myself to play this character one last time, to show up to this wedding weekend, and let them put their arrogance on full display. I would attend the pre-wedding brunch. I would sit through the rehearsal dinner. I would watch them grovel for the approval of Wyatt and his pretentious family. And then, when the time was perfectly right, I would pull back the curtain and let their entire house of cards collapse under the weight of reality. The pre-wedding brunch was held the next morning at the Oak Ridge Country Club, a sprawling estate of manicured pudding greens and exclusionary membership fees that my father had undoubtedly begged to access. I arrived precisely on time, pulling my modest rental car into the lot rather than my usual custom SUV. For the occasion, I had chosen my wardrobe with tactical precision. I wore a simple, unbranded beige linen dress. To the untrained eye, or more specifically, to my mother's logo-obsessed eye, it looked like something plucked off a discount rack. In reality, it was a bespoke piece from an independent designer in Milan, woven from fabrics that cost more than Jasmine's entire bridal shower outfit. But it lacked the flashy interlocking letters and obvious designer tags that my family equated with wealth, which meant it was absolutely perfect for my role as the struggling broke sister. Before I could even reach the mimosa bar in the foyer, a hand clamped down hard on my forearm. I turned to find my mother, Brenda. Her face was plastered with a terrifyingly bright smile intended for the room, while her eyes glared absolute daggers at me. Without saying a word, she dragged me behind a massive towering floral arrangement near the coat check, safely out of sight from the main dining room. "What on earth are you wearing?" she hissed through gritted teeth, her heavy diamond earrings shaking with her quiet rage. "You look like you are heading to a community college study group. I told you Wyatt's parents are here. The entire Thornton family is sitting right inside that room, and you show up looking like you buy your clothes by the pound." I kept my expression perfectly mild, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle on my skirt. "It is a clean dress, Mom. I thought we were here to celebrate Jasmine. We are here to show the Thorntons that we are a family of substance," she snapped aggressively, adjusting the lapels of her own heavily branded blazer. "Listen to me closely, Kiara. The photographer is going to be circling the tables in about 20 minutes to get candid shots. I need you to stay near the buffet line or go hide in the restroom when he comes to our section. You are not ruining these professional pictures looking like a charity case. And do not bring up your tuition or your endless classes. If anyone asks you, tell them you are in a transition period." A transition period, I repeated, committing the ridiculous phrase to memory. "Got it. I will stay completely out of the way." Satisfied that she had successfully put me in my place, Brenda patted her hair, smoothed her features, and floated back toward the VIP tables. Her face instantly morphed into a mask of pure subservient joy the moment she was back in public view. I took a deep, centering breath and stepped into the main dining room. The dynamic was immediately obvious and entirely pathetic. The Thorntons were impossible to miss. They sat at the grand center table, exuding that specific brand of generational wealth that did not need to shout to be heard. Wyatt's parents, Richard and Beatrice, sat with rigid, perfect posture, wearing muted pastel colors. They looked at the extravagant brunch spread and the surrounding decor with mild, polite disdain. Wyatt sat beside Jasmine, looking incredibly smug, already acting like he owned the entire building. And then there was my father. It was honestly painful to watch him perform. Calvin was practically vibrating with the desperate effort to impress these people. He was leaning across the wide table, laughing uproariously at a joke Richard had just made, a joke that barely warranted a polite chuckle. Calvin's suit was a little too shiny, his luxury watch a little too large and obvious. He was the very picture of a man frantically trying to prove his worth to a white, wealthy family that was actively, silently looking down on him. I found a seat at a small overflow table near the back of the room, sharing space with a few distant cousins who barely acknowledged me. Just as I sat down, I watched a waiter approach Calvin with a digital ordering tablet. I saw my father nod vigorously, waving his hand in a grand theatrical gesture meant for the whole room to see. "Bring us 3 bottles of the vintage Dom Perignon," Calvin announced loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the surrounding tables. "Only the absolute best for our new family today." I pulled out my phone under the table and quickly did the math in my head. The vintage he had just ordered ran about $400 a bottle at standard country club markup. With the private event taxes and gratuity, he was dropping over $1,500 on morning champagne just to look rich in front of a man who probably owned his own private vineyard. I stared at him from across the room, feeling a profound sense of irony wash over me. Less than 24 hours ago, this same man had threatened to derail my entire academic future and cut me off completely over a $15,000 catering bill he could not afford to pay. The financial hypocrisy was staggering. My father was quite literally drinking his retirement savings to buy the illusion of respect. Across the room, I watched Jasmine lean into Wyatt, deliberately flashing her massive engagement ring whenever the morning light caught it. She looked over the crowd, and her eyes eventually found my table. Her gaze scanned my plain linen dress, and a distinct cruel smirk crossed her face. She leaned over and whispered something directly into Wyatt's ear. Wyatt looked in my direction, gave a short dismissive snort of laughter, and shook his head before returning to his conversation with his father. They were bonding over my perceived failure. I was the safe target, the designated loser of the family that made Jasmine look like the ultimate success story by comparison. I stayed at my corner table, quietly sipping sparkling water and eating a pastry. Several extended family members passed by on their way to the buffet, offering me tight, pitying smiles. My Aunt Valerie paused just long enough to pat my shoulder and tell me that God had a plan for everyone, even late bloomers, before hurrying off to fawn over Jasmine. I thanked her politely, keeping my face completely blank. Every insult, every microaggression, every sideways glance and whispered joke was just fuel for the fire I was preparing to unleash. The brunch dragged on, serving as a masterclass in social climbing and financial ruin. My parents were so blinded by the glare of the Thornton family wealth that they could not see the massive cliff they were sprinting toward. I sat quietly in the back, exactly where my mother had ordered me to be, acting like a ghost in my own family. But ghosts have a funny way of haunting the people who create them. And my time was coming very soon. The extravagant bottles of Dom Perignon arrived at the center table with entirely too much fanfare. I watched from my seat in the back corner as the waiters popped the corks, the golden liquid fizzing into the crystal flutes of the VIP guests. Calvin adjusted his tie, threw his shoulders back, and stood up. He grabbed a butter knife and tapped it sharply against his glass. The ringing sound cut through the low hum of conversation, and the dining room gradually fell silent. My father plastered on his most charismatic, practiced smile. He began his speech by fawning over the Thorntons. He talked endlessly about the beautiful union of two great families, praising Jasmine's beauty and showering Wyatt with compliments about his corporate ambition. Brenda sat beside him, nodding along with the perfect, rigid posture of a supportive matriarch, looking absolutely thrilled by the proximity to wealth. But Calvin could never just leave it at a simple congratulation. He had an audience, and he needed to solidify his image. He needed Richard and Beatrice Thornton to see him not just as an equal, but as a man of limitless resources and boundless benevolence. To do that, he needed a foil. He looked past the towering floral centerpieces and scanned the room until his eyes locked onto me at the overflow table. "You know, Richard," Beatrice, Calvin said, projecting his voice so it echoed off the country club walls, "being a father is a lifelong financial commitment. You raise your children, you fund their dreams, and you never ever close your wallet. Take my eldest daughter, Kiara, sitting right back there." He gestured broadly in my direction. Dozens of heads turned in unison. I felt the collective gaze of the entire room land heavily on my plain linen dress. "Some children fly out of the nest early, like our beautiful Jasmine." Calvin continued, his tone dripping with theatrical martyrdom. "But Kiara here is teaching me the true meaning of patience. I am still paying her endless college tuition, 35 years old, and she is still trying to find her major. But what can a supportive father do? You do not cut off your children when they are struggling to find direction. You just keep writing the checks, carry the burden, and pray they eventually figure it out." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. It was not warm or inclusive laughter. It was the condescending, pitying chuckle of wealthy people mocking an obvious failure. Wyatt leaned back in his chair, swirling his champagne, and smirked at me with undisguised contempt. His father, Richard, let out a deep, booming laugh and raised his glass to Calvin in a gesture of shared patriarchal burden. Jasmine looked down at her lap, a perfectly manicured smile of superiority playing on her lips. Even my mother offered a heavy, dramatic sigh for the crowd, playing the role of the exhausted parent to perfection. The distant cousins sitting next to me shifted awkwardly in their seats, actively leaning away from me as if failure were a contagious disease. I did not flinch. I did not look down. I did not let a single ounce of embarrassment or hurt show on my face. Instead, I looked directly at my father. I picked up my simple glass of tap water, raised it toward him in a polite, silent salute, and took a slow, deliberate sip. To the room, I looked like a humbled, dependent daughter, meekly accepting her father's public reprimand. To me, this was simply data collection. In my world of corporate acquisitions and data analytics, you never react to incomplete data sets. You let the algorithm run. You let the subjects reveal their true behavioral patterns without interference. I was logging every word, every laugh, every condescending glance into my mental ledger. The absolute audacity of his performance was breathtaking. Calvin was standing in a rented country club wearing a suit he undoubtedly bought on credit, bragging to a family of strangers about funding an education I had finished over a decade ago on a full academic scholarship. I was playing the role of the generous billionaire philanthropist in public while frantically demanding a $15,000 catering bailout from me via text message just hours earlier. If this had happened 5 years ago, the public shaming would have crushed me. I would have excused myself to the restroom, cried in a stall, and wondered why I was never good enough for their respect. But sitting there today with the knowledge of the empire I had built entirely without them, I felt nothing but cold, calculated anticipation. I was a CEO evaluating a failing asset. My father had just publicly declared that I was a financial drain on his non-existent wealth. He had handed me the exact narrative I needed. When the time came to project my own financial receipts onto the wedding reception screen, I would quote this exact toast back to him word for word. The speech concluded with thunderous applause from the Thornton family. Calvin sat back down, wiping a fake tear of pride from his eye, thoroughly satisfied with his performance. The brunch resumed its noisy chatter, the clinking of silverware returning as the attention finally shifted off my table. I set my water glass back down on the white tablecloth and smoothed my napkin over my lap. The first phase of my operation was complete. They had established their lies, set the stakes, and chosen their target. All I had to do was remain perfectly quiet and let them keep digging their own graves. I watched Wyatt excuse himself from the main table and begin making his way through the room, heading deliberately in my direction. The groom clearly wanted to add his own 2 cents to the narrative my father had just established, and I was more than ready to let him speak. I stood up and made my way toward the extravagant brunch buffet. If I was going to endure a lecture from my future brother-in-law, I might as well do it with a plate of fresh fruit. Wyatt intercepted me right beside the carving station. He stood too close, invading my personal space with that unearned confidence typical of mediocre men who mistake their privilege for actual talent. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit and a smug expression that mirrored the one my sister wore so well. "Kiara," he said, dragging out my name like a disappointed parent addressing a stubborn teenager. "That was quite a speech your dad gave. I have to admit my parents were a little shocked. In our family, independence is sort of the bare minimum expectation by the time you hit 22. I picked up the silver tongs and placed a slice of melon on my plate. I am sure they were surprised, Wyatt. Calvin has a very unique way of telling stories. Wyatt leaned against the buffet table, deliberately shifting his weight to block my path to the pastries. He crossed his arms and looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my unbranded dress with clear disapproval. "Listen, I am going to shoot straight with you, because someone in this family has to. Jasmine and I are starting a life together. We are building a brand. Having a 35-year-old sister-in-law who still relies on her parents for an allowance is not exactly a great look for our optics, especially with my upcoming promotion to vice president. I need my circle to reflect success." I maintained steady eye contact, letting him dig his grave deeper. "Congratulations on the potential promotion," I said smoothly. Wyatt waved his hand dismissively, as if a VP title was his absolute birthright. "It is basically a done deal. But back to you. I talked to some people in my department. I am a director at Apex Solutions, you know. We are a massive corporate software firm, very fast-paced, very demanding. We always need low-level data entry clerks. It is minimum wage, and it is incredibly tedious, but it is honest work. I can get you in at the bottom. It is time to grow up, Kiara. It is hard work, but it is better than leeching off your dad forever." Right on cue, Jasmine appeared at Wyatt's side. She slipped her arm through his, resting her head on his shoulder while flashing her engagement ring so the diamonds caught the chandelier light. She looked from Wyatt to me, her eyes gleaming with triumphant malice. "You should really take him up on it," Kiara Jasmine chimed in, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Wyatt is sticking his neck out for you. The least you could do is say thank you and try to finally make something of yourself. We cannot keep covering for your lack of ambition." It is embarrassing for me to explain to his family why my older sister is still taking freshman seminars. The irony was almost physically heavy. Apex Solutions was indeed a corporate software firm, but calling it massive was a generous stretch. I knew their quarterly reports better than Wyatt did. I knew their profit margins were shrinking, and their middle management sector was bloated with overpaid directors who produced very little actual value. I knew all of this because my own data analytics firm had been running financial valuations on them for months. Yet here was Wyatt puffing out his chest, offering me a minimum wage desk job at a company that was struggling to keep its head above water. He wanted to be my savior. He wanted to toss me a crumb so he could feel like the benevolent, successful white knight rescuing his wife's pathetic, lazy sister. It was a textbook microaggression wrapped in a wedding brunch invitation. I looked at Jasmine, then back to Wyatt. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my work ethic. I did not list my actual credentials or explain that my net worth eclipsed his entire family's trust fund. I simply offered them a polite, entirely unbothered smile. "That is incredibly generous of you, Wyatt." I said, my tone perfectly, even and completely devoid of sarcasm. "I will definitely keep your company in mind." Wyatt scoffed, clearly disappointed that I had not burst into grateful tears or defensive anger. "Do not wait too long," he warned, adjusting his expensive tie with a flick of his wrist. "My generosity has an expiration date. I cannot hold a desk open for a perpetual student forever. Real businesses move fast." He turned and guided Jasmine back toward the center of the room. They walked away whispering and laughing together, thoroughly satisfied with their perceived dominance. I watched them go, my plate balanced in one hand. I took a bite of the melon, chewing slowly. My generosity had an expiration date too, and theirs was approaching faster than they could possibly comprehend. The air inside the Oak Ridge Country Club was growing entirely too thick with the scent of expensive perfume and unearned arrogance. I set my plate on a passing waiter's tray and quietly slipped through the heavy glass doors, leading out to the veranda. The crisp morning air hit my face, providing an immediate and much-needed cleanse from the suffocating atmosphere of my family's social climbing. I walked over to the stone balustrade and leaned against it, taking a moment to simply breathe and look out over the manicured golf course. My phone vibrated sharply in the pocket of my linen dress. I pulled it out fully, expecting another demanding text from my father, reminding me about the catering bill, or a passive-aggressive message from my mother, dictating where I was allowed to stand. Instead, a priority notification flashed across my screen from my secure private server. It was an email from David, my lead corporate acquisitions attorney. The subject line contained a single beautiful word: executed. I opened the message, my eyes rapidly scanning the encrypted legal documents attached to the email. The corporate jargon was dense, but the conclusion was absolute. After 6 months of aggressive negotiations, rigorous financial audits, and endless boardroom maneuvering, the ink was finally dry. My data analytics firm had officially completed its most ambitious corporate buyout to date. The wire transfers had cleared, the regulatory approvals were secured, and the board had signed off on the final transition documents. I scrolled down to the executive summary, tracing the name of the newly acquired asset with my index finger just to see it in writing. Apex Solutions, the exact same mid-tier corporate software firm where Wyatt currently served as a director. The exact same company where he had just so graciously offered to get me a minimum wage data entry job at the bottom of the ladder so I could finally make something of myself. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. I looked up from my screen and peered through the glass doors back into the dining room. I could see Wyatt standing near the mimosa bar, holding court with a few of my younger cousins. He was puffing his chest out, gesturing broadly with his champagne flute as he likely recounted the tale of his inevitable promotion to vice president. He had built his entire identity around climbing the corporate ladder at Apex. He tied his worths, his arrogance, and his blatant superiority complex to that specific corporate structure. He honestly believed he was a king making brilliant moves on a grand chessboard. He had absolutely no idea that I had just bought the entire board. As the sole founder and CEO of the acquiring parent company, Apex Solutions now existed entirely under my umbrella. The structural reorganization meant that every department, every budget allocation, and every executive promotion now required my ultimate approval. That vice president role Wyatt had been so aggressively bragging about to my father all morning was no longer a guaranteed trajectory. His career progression, his salary scale, his year-end bonuses, and his very employment status now rested squarely in the palm of my hand. The sheer beautiful irony of the situation washed over me. Less than 5 minutes ago, my future brother-in-law had looked me dead in the eye and told me it was time to grow up. He had offered me the scraps off his corporate table so he could play the benevolent savior to his wife's pathetic broke sister. He thought he was tossing a coin to a beggar. He did not realize he had just insulted the woman who now owned the bank. I read through David's notes on the transition timeline. The public announcement of the acquisition was scheduled to hit the financial newswires on Monday morning, exactly one day after the wedding. Until then, everything remained under a strict non-disclosure agreement. The timing could not have been scripted more perfectly by a Hollywood director. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. The temptation to walk right back into that dining room, tap my water glass and announce my new acquisition to the entire Thornton family was incredibly strong. I could picture the exact shade of pale Wyatt's face would turn. I could imagine the absolute shock paralyzing my father as he realized the daughter he just publicly humiliated for being a financial burden was actually a corporate titan. But playing my hand now would be a massive waste of perfectly good leverage. Wyatt and Jasmine wanted a grand stage to show off their superiority. My father wanted a luxurious backdrop to prove his status. They wanted a captive audience for their arrogance. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I was going to let them enjoy their rehearsal dinner, let them revel in their false sense of dominance, and let them walk into that extravagant wedding reception feeling entirely untouchable. I smoothed down my dress, adjusted my posture, and pulled open the heavy glass doors to rejoin the brunch. I was no longer just the broke perpetual student sister showing up for a free meal. I was the CEO walking right back into a room full of my newly acquired assets. The evening sky over the city was a deep bruised purple by the time I pulled up to the valet stand at Laura, a notoriously exclusive downtown restaurant chosen for the rehearsal dinner. The venue was exactly the kind of establishment my father favored. It relied heavily on crystal chandeliers, velvet seating, and a menu where the prices were intentionally omitted to intimidate the clientele into spending more. I stepped out of my car wearing a tailored navy silk slip dress. Like my morning attire. It was completely devoid of visible labels but crafted from silk that felt like liquid over my skin. To my family, a lack of logos meant a lack of funds. To me, it meant freedom. I walked into the private dining room reserved for our party. The space was divided into two distinct zones. The front half, bathed in warm, flattering light from the floor-to-ceiling windows, featured long, elegant tables draped in floral runners. This was the undisputed VIP section. The Thorntons were already seated there, looking appropriately bored and wealthy. Wyatt was holding a glass of scotch, laughing loudly at something his uncle had just said. Jasmine sat beside him, wearing a white cocktail dress that looked impossibly uncomfortable, scanning the room to ensure everyone was watching her. I approached the ornate seating chart displayed on an easel near the entrance. I traced my finger down the list of names at the head table. Calvin, Brenda, Jasmine, Wyatt, Richard, Beatrice. My name was absent. I checked table 2. I checked table 3. I finally found my meticulously calligraphed place card at table 9. Table 9 was not just in the back of the room. It was practically in a different zip code. It was a tiny, cramped circular table shoved aggressively into the dark corner, right next to the swinging wooden doors of the restaurant kitchen. The romantic ambient lighting of the main dining room did not reach this far back. Instead, table 9 was illuminated by the harsh fluorescent glare spilling out every time a waiter kicked the doors open with a tray of appetizers. It was the designated reject table reserved for random plus ones and distant relatives who were invited purely out of obligation. Before I could even pull out my chair, a cloud of heavy, expensive perfume announced my mother's arrival. Brenda glided out of the shadows, grabbing my elbow with a grip that pinched my skin. She pulled me a few steps back toward the hallway, her fake public smile dropping the second we were out of the Thorntons' line of sight. "I see you found your seat," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, rapid whisper. "Right by the kitchen doors," I noted, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "It is very atmospheric. I can hear the chef yelling at the sous chefs from here." Brenda rolled her eyes, tightening her grip on my arm. "Do not start with me tonight, Kiara." Wyatt's extended family flew in from Connecticut, and they required the premium seating near the windows. We have an image to maintain this evening. The Thorntons are accustomed to a certain caliber of company. She paused, looking me up and down with an expression of profound distaste. She reached out and adjusted the strap of my silk dress, as if trying to fix something fundamentally broken. "To be completely honest with you," she whispered, leaning in closer, "your presence brings down the aesthetic of the VIP tables. We need to project absolute success tonight. We cannot have Wyatt's family asking you about your career or your finances. You being front and center would just invite awkward questions that your father and I do not want to answer. Sit at table 9, keep your head down, eat your dinner, and do not mingle with the Thorntons. Understood?" I looked at my mother. She was drowning in credit card debt, wearing a rented designer gown, and sweating through her makeup in a desperate bid to impress a family that barely tolerated her. She was hiding her most successful child in a dark corner next to the dishwashing station because she was ashamed of the fictional version of me she had created in her own head. It was a masterclass in projection. I gave her a gentle, reassuring nod. "Loud and clear, Mom. I will stay completely out of the VIP zone. You will not even know I am here." Brenda exhaled a sharp breath of relief, her public smile snapping back into place instantly. "Good, see that you do." She turned on her heel and marched back toward the glowing center of the room, ready to resume her performance. I walked over to table 9 and took my seat. The heavy wooden doors behind me swung open, hitting the back of my chair slightly as a busboy rushed past. The clattering of pots and pans was loud enough to drown out the string quartet playing near the front windows. I sat back in my chair, completely unfazed. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone, while my parents spent the next 2 hours exhausting themselves by kissing the ring of Wyatt's family. I opened my secure corporate email app. I had transition documents to review. I had integration schedules to approve. I was sitting in the darkest, loudest, most insulting corner of the restaurant, quietly executing executive orders that would completely dismantle the career of the man sitting at the head table. Let them have their aesthetic. I was too busy managing my empire to care about the seating chart. I finished reviewing the final integration timeline on my phone and decided to take a brief walk to stretch my legs. The kitchen noise was giving me a slight headache, and I needed a moment away from the clattering dishes. I slipped away from table 9 and headed down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the restrooms. The ladies' room at this restaurant was exactly what you would expect from a place that catered to the city elite. It featured gold-plated fixtures, floor-to-ceiling mirrors, and a lounge area that felt more like a boutique hotel lobby than a public restroom. I walked over to the marble sink, turned on the warm water, and began to wash my hands. The heavy wooden door swung open behind me with aggressive force. Jasmine marched into the restroom, her white silk cocktail dress rustling loudly in the quiet space. She reached behind her and locked the door with a sharp, echoing click. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and glared at me through the reflection in the mirror. Her face was flushed red, and the sweet, demure mask she had been wearing all evening for her future in-laws was completely gone. She did not bother with a polite greeting. "Why is the catering balance still unpaid?" she demanded, her voice sharp and echoing off the expensive tile. "Dad checked his account right before we sat down for dinner. The $15,000 is not there, Kiara. You were supposed to wire the funds this morning." I turned the water off and reached for a monogrammed linen towel. I dried my hands slowly, intentionally taking my time to let her anxiety build. I turned to face her, keeping my posture completely relaxed. "I did not wire the money because I am not paying for your wedding catering, Jasmine," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "That is a bill for you, your wealthy fiancé, or your parents to handle." Jasmine let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. She stepped closer, invading my personal space just like Wyatt had done earlier that day. They really were a match made in heaven. "Are you entirely out of your mind?" she hissed, her eyes wide with panic and rage. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing it will be if they pull the upgraded menu tomorrow? Wyatt's family is expecting a certain standard. They are accustomed to fine dining. You are going to ruin my perfect day because you want to be stubborn and selfish." She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "Let us be incredibly honest right now. It is not like you have anything else going on in your life. You have no husband. You have absolutely no career to speak of. You sit in your tiny apartment taking random online classes while the rest of us are actually building futures and securing our family legacy. You should be honored to contribute to this wedding. What else are you possibly spending your little savings on? Just pull up your banking app and transfer the funds right now. I looked at my younger sister and felt a profound sense of clarity. She was 30 years old, about to marry a corporate director, yet she was throwing a frantic temper tantrum in a restaurant bathroom because I refused to subsidize her luxury aesthetic. The sheer entitlement was staggering. She truly believed that because I did not fit her narrow status-obsessed definition of success, my sole purpose on this earth was to fund her vanity projects. She viewed my money as her money simply because she deemed her life more valuable than mine. This was the darkest, most toxic version of family expectation. She saw me as a blank check, a resource to be drained so she could maintain her illusion of grandeur. My financial status is absolutely none of your concern, I said, looking her dead in the eye. But I will make this very clear for you tonight. I am not your backup plan. I am not our father's emergency fund. And I am certainly not paying $15,000 to feed a room full of people who actively looked down on me and seated me next to a dishwashing station. My bank account is officially closed to you and to this entire family. Jasmine's mouth dropped open. The reality of my refusal seemed to finally hit her, and her arrogant anger was quickly replaced by genuine, unadulterated panic. She knew just as well as I did that Calvin and Brenda were completely tapped out. Their credit cards were maxed, and their savings were depleted. If I did not pay that remaining balance, the catering staff would downgrade their extravagant 5-course meal to the basic package, and Wyatt's pretentious parents would notice the drop in quality immediately. The flawless, wealthy image my family had fought so hard to project would crack right down the middle. "You are going to regret this," she sneered, her voice trembling as she backed away toward the door. "Dad is going to cut off your tuition tomorrow morning. He promised he would do it if you embarrassed us. You will have nothing, Kiara. You will be entirely on your own, and you will finally see what a failure you really are." I dropped the linen towel into the brass hamper. I thought about the corporate acquisition documents sitting in my secure inbox. I thought about how Wyatt was about to lose his job, and how Jasmine's entire social identity was tied to a man who was about to become my subordinate. "I have been on my own for a very long time, Jasmine," I said softly. "You all just never paid enough attention to notice. Enjoy your rehearsal dinner." I walked past her, unlocked the heavy wooden door, and stepped back out into the hallway, leaving my sister staring at her own furious reflection in the gold-plated mirrors. I stepped out of the restroom, leaving Jasmine to deal with her own reflection. The hallway connecting the facilities to the main dining room was lined with dark mahogany paneling and temperature-controlled wine displays. It was quiet here, the cheerful music and clinking glasses muffled by the heavy architecture. I took a deep breath, preparing to return to table 9 and finish out the evening in my designated corner. Before I could take 3 steps, a large, heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. The grip was hard enough to bruise. I was shoved backward, my shoulders hitting the solid wood paneling of the hallway. I looked up to see my father, Calvin. The jovial, laughing patriarch who had just toasted to Wyatt's family was completely gone. In his place was a desperate, furious man whose financial house of cards was currently catching fire. His jaw was clenched, a visible vein pulsing at his temple, and his eyes were dark with unmasked rage. Jasmine must have texted him from the bathroom the second I walked out. "What exactly did you just say to your sister?" he demanded, his voice a harsh, guttural whisper, designed to keep the patrons in the dining room from hearing his meltdown. I kept my posture completely straight, refusing to shrink against the wall. "I told her the absolute truth," I replied smoothly. "I am not wiring $15,000 to cover a catering bill for a party that I was actively hidden away from." Calvin stepped closer, using his physical size to try and intimidate me. This was his classic move whenever he felt his control slipping. He would drop the charismatic charm and rely on pure aggressive dominance. "You are going to take your phone out right now. Open your banking app and transfer those funds," he hissed, his breath hot and smelling faintly of the expensive champagne he had bought to impress strangers. "You are not going to ruin this weekend for us. I have worked too hard to secure this family's position. Wyatt's parents are watching our every move." Do you have any idea what it looks like if the caterers start pulling items from the menu tomorrow? It looks like you planned a wedding you could not afford, I stated plainly. Which is exactly what happened. You and Mom drained your accounts to impress a family that barely acknowledges your existence. That is your financial crisis to manage, not mine. My father's face contorted with fury. He slammed his hand flat against the wall right next to my head. The sudden noise echoed sharply in the empty corridor. Listen to me, you ungrateful disappointment, he growled. We have carried your dead weight for years. While Jasmine actually made something of herself, you have been sitting around taking classes, trying to find your purpose, like some lost teenager. We have defended you. We have paid for you. We have let you live under the protection of our family name. And this is how you repay us. By being a selfish, stubborn liability when your sister needs you the most. The sheer delusion of his monologue was breathtaking. He had fully convinced himself of his own lie. He actually believed he was my provider. He believed that the meager, sporadic couple of $100 he sent me over the last decade somehow equated to funding my entire existence. He needed to believe I was dependent on him so he could feel powerful, especially when standing next to men like Richard Thornton, who possessed actual wealth. I looked at him, feeling a strange mix of pity and absolute disdain. I am not opening my banking app, I said, keeping my tone deadly calm. And I am not giving you a single dime. Calvin backed away slightly, his chest heaving as he stared at me with pure venom. He straightened his suit jacket, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. He had realized physical intimidation was not working, so he reached for his ultimate weapon. Financial manipulation. Fine, he said, his voice dropping to a deadly, icy whisper. If you want to play this game, we will play it. If you walk back into that dining room without transferring the money, I am cutting off your college tuition tomorrow morning. Every single cent. I will call the registrar myself. I will stop the auto drafts. I will leave you with absolutely nothing. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air, expecting me to crumble, expecting me to panic and beg for his support. And it goes beyond the money, Kiara. He continued, leaning in close so I could hear the absolute finality in his tone. If you embarrass us tomorrow, you are completely dead to this family. You will not come to the holidays. You will not call your mother. You will be entirely on your own. You will have no safety net, no family, and no future. You are nothing without my money. The words hung in the dimly lit hallway. You are nothing without my money. It was the ultimate curse of the black tax, weaponized by a man who had absolutely nothing left in his bank account. He was trying to extort $15,000 from me by threatening to withhold $0. He was holding a gun to my head, completely unaware that it was utterly unloaded. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel like an inadequate burden. I looked at the father who chose social status over his own daughter's dignity. He wanted me to break. He wanted me to cry and hand over my hard-earned savings to fix his pathetic mistakes. Instead, I felt an overwhelming wave of liberation. The invisible chains of familial obligations simply dissolved. He had just given me the exact permission I needed to burn his entire facade to the ground. The silence stretched between us. He was waiting for the breakdown. He was waiting for the tears to well up in my eyes, for my voice to shake, for me to beg him not to cut off my imaginary tuition. Instead, I simply looked at him. I looked dead into the eyes of a man who would gladly sell his daughter's peace of mind to buy a round of applause from strangers. I did not shrink. I did not cry. I stood completely still, letting the absolute weight of my silence press against him until I saw a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of uncertainty cross his face. You are absolutely right, I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. Our financial relationship is officially severed. As of this exact moment, you no longer owe me a single cent, and I no longer owe you my compliance. Calvin blinked, clearly thrown off balance. This was not the script he had written in his head. I was supposed to be panicking. I was supposed to be negotiating. But his narcissism quickly kicked back in, overriding that brief flash of confusion. He puffed out his chest, interpreting my calm acceptance as a defeated surrender. He thought I was simply trying to save face while waving the white flag. Good, he grunted, pointing a thick finger at me. I am glad you finally understand how things work in the real world. You wire that money to the catering company by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, or do not bother showing up to the ceremony. I will not have you sitting in the pews while I deal with a disaster. I reached up and gently, almost clinically, removed his hand from the wall near my head. I smoothed the fabric of my silk dress where he had grabbed me earlier. I am not wiring the $15,000 tonight, Calvin, I said, using his first name with deliberate precision. His eyes flared wide, ready to launch into another tirade, but I held up my hand to stop him. Because wiring money is so impersonal, I continued smoothly. Jasmine is my only sister. Wyatt is joining our family. A wire transfer simply does not capture the magnitude of this occasion. I am going to bring a physical wedding gift to the reception tomorrow. I am going to hand it directly to the groom in front of everyone. I stepped closer to him, closing the distance he had tried to use for intimidation. I promise you, Calvin, it is going to be a gift that flawlessly reflects the true value of this family. It will be a gift that perfectly aligns with Wyatt's corporate work ethic. By the time I hand him that envelope tomorrow, no one in that room will ever forget my contribution to this wedding. Calvin stared at me, his chest rising and falling as he processed my words. His arrogant brain ran the calculation and landed on the exact wrong conclusion. He sneered, a slow, deeply satisfied grin spreading across his face. He assumed I had caved entirely. He assumed my pride was preventing me from wiring the money immediately, and that my grand promise of a physical gift meant I was going to show up with a certified check for the 15,000 plus perhaps a little extra to apologize for my stubbornness. He thought I was preparing to publicly grovel to protect my precious tuition money. See that you do, he said, adjusting his lapels and checking his reflection in the dark glass of the wine display cabinet. Bring the check directly to the head table after the speeches. Do not make a scene. And until then, you go back to table 9 and you sit quietly. We have important guests to entertain. He turned his back on me without another word, marching confidently down the mahogany hallway toward the glowing lights of the VIP section. He walked like a king, returning to his court completely unaware that he had just officially abdicated his throne. I stood alone in the quiet corridor for a few moments, letting the interaction settle in my bones. There was no grief. There was no lingering childhood trauma aging in my chest. The little girl who used to crave her father's validation was completely gone, replaced by a woman who recognized a bad investment and knew exactly how to liquidate it. He had drawn the line in the sand, and I had happily stepped right over it. The suffocating weight of the black tax, the endless unspoken obligation to carry people who actively disrespected me, evaporated entirely. I was free. I did not go back to table 9. I had collected all the data I needed for the evening. I walked out the side exit of the restaurant, bypassing the valet stand, and stepped into the cool night air. I opened my phone and sent a quick text message to David, my lead attorney. Print the Apex Solutions corporate restructuring notice and my CEO transition letter on the premium watermark cardstock. Put it in a sealed executive envelope. Have my driver bring it to me by noon tomorrow. David replied less than a minute later. Consider it done. Enjoy the wedding. I requested a premium black car service and watched the taillights of passing vehicles blur in the downtown traffic as I waited. My father thought I was nothing without his money. My sister thought my life was a pathetic joke. My future brother-in-law thought I was desperate for a minimum wage handout. They had spent months building a massive glittering stage for their own vanity, entirely funded by lies and credit card debt. Tomorrow they were going to get exactly the spotlight they wanted. I climbed into the back of my ride, leaned my head against the plush leather seat, and smiled into the darkness. I was going to sleep incredibly well tonight. The afternoon sun caught the edge of a massive, intricately carved ice sculpture stationed directly at the entrance of the grand ballroom. It was a sprawling, ridiculous depiction of intertwined swans, strategically designed to slowly drip premium vodka into a crystal luge. This was the first thing guests saw as they stepped into the venue, and it set the exact tone my parents wanted: absurd, unadulterated opulence. I walked through the towering oak doors of the estate and took in the sheer financial hemorrhage happening in real time. The ceiling of the ballroom had been completely obscured by tens of thousands of white Phalaenopsis orchids air-freighted overnight from Thailand just to achieve a cascading canopy effect. The lighting was entirely custom programmed to shift imperceptibly from a soft romantic blush during the cocktail hour to a crisp, brilliant gold for the dinner service. Every table was draped in imported Italian silk and lined with towering crystal candelabras that caught the light and threw rainbows across the room. To the hundreds of guests filing into the venue, it looked like a fairy tale. To me, looking at it through the lens of a data analyst and CEO, it looked like a financial suicide note. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and moved toward the perimeter of the room. I did not mingle. I simply watched the performance unfold. My father was standing near the carved ice luge holding court with a group of Wyatt's uncles. Calvin was playing the role of the limitless billionaire to absolute perfection. He was wearing a custom tuxedo, laughing loudly, and casually peeling crisp $100 bills from a money clip to tip the bartenders every time they refilled his glass. He was putting on a masterclass in aggressive generosity. Across the room, my mother was practically vibrating with desperate energy. Brenda was hovering inches away from Beatrice Thornton Wyatt's mother. Brenda wore a heavily beaded gown that I knew for a fact cost more than her car. She was laughing too eagerly at every mundane comment Beatrice made, aggressively agreeing with her opinions on the weather, the catering, and the string quartet playing softly in the corner. Brenda was shrinking herself, modifying her voice, and trying to mold her entire existence to fit into the Thornton family's definition of acceptable society. It was deeply pathetic, but it was also a perfect representation of the exact family dynamic that had driven me away. Calvin and Brenda were bleeding their retirement accounts completely dry. They had taken out second mortgages. They had maxed out every high-interest credit card they owned. They had liquidated whatever meager savings they had accumulated over 30 years of working middle-class jobs. Every single cent of their future security had been sacrificed to fund this 6-hour charade. They were destroying their own lives just to prove their worth to a white, wealthy family that viewed them as nothing more than entertaining novelties. I watched Richard and Beatrice Thornton navigate the room. They accepted the lavish food and the premium drinks, but their eyes held that unmistakable gleam of generational superiority. They were not impressed by the ice swans or the imported orchids. True wealth does not need to shout, and my parents were screaming at the top of their lungs. The Thorntons knew exactly what this was. It was a desperate, overcompensated attempt to buy respect. They were happy to eat the expensive food, but they would never view my parents as equals. I walked quietly toward my assigned seat in the very last row of the ceremony seating area. The chairs were plush velvet, arranged in perfect semicircles around a massive floral arch. I sat down, smoothing my simple dress, and placed my designer clutch on my lap. Inside that clutch was the sealed executive envelope David had couriered to my penthouse that morning. The heavy watermarked cardstock rested perfectly against my phone, a tangible reminder of the power I held. As the string quartet shifted their tempo to signal the beginning of the ceremony, I watched my family take their places. Jasmine was waiting in the wings, preparing to make her grand entrance in a gown that likely cost a small fortune. Wyatt stood at the altar, adjusting his cuffs, looking incredibly pleased with himself and the kingdom he thought he was marrying into. They had built a flawless, glittering illusion. They had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to construct a reality where they were the ultimate success stories, and I was the embarrassing broke failure hidden in the back row. They felt completely untouchable. I leaned back in my velvet chair, watching the custom lighting cast a golden glow over the altar. I did not feel angry. I did not feel resentful. I felt the absolute unshakable calm of a woman who knows exactly how the movie ends. I was going to let them have their beautiful ceremony. I was going to let them take their perfect photos and eat their expensive dinner. I was going to let the illusion reach its absolute peak before I brought the entire structure crashing down to earth. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open. The string quartet shifted seamlessly into the traditional bridal chorus. The entire congregation rose to their feet in a synchronized wave of rustling silk and tailored suits. I stood up with them, keeping my position firmly anchored in the very last row. From my vantage point at the back of the room, the entire spectacle looked less like a wedding and more like a carefully blocked theatrical production. Jasmine stepped into the aisle, her arm hooked tightly through our father's. She looked undeniably beautiful, but it was a manufactured, highly curated beauty. Her gown was a massive structured ball gown, covered in hand-sewn pearls that caught the golden lighting exactly as intended. She wore a practiced, radiant smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Her gaze flicked constantly to the front row, checking Beatrice Thornton's reaction before scanning the rest of the room to ensure every phone camera was pointed in her direction. She was not a bride soaking in a moment of pure joy. She was an actress delivering the performance of her life. Beside her, Calvin puffed his chest out so far the buttons on his custom tuxedo looked strained. He walked down that aisle with the exaggerated swagger of a conquering king. He was literally giving away his daughter, but his body language screamed that he was the one receiving the ultimate prize. He was finally getting the proximity to white corporate wealth he had craved his entire life. I watched them take their slow, measured steps toward the altar. Wyatt stood waiting, his hands clasped in front of him. His smile was not one of overwhelming love. It was the exact same smug, victorious smirk a man wears when he successfully closes a lucrative business deal. He looked at Jasmine like a newly acquired asset that would look fantastic on his holiday cards and corporate retreat brochures. Standing there in the shadows, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of decaying orchids and melting ice sculptures. A profound wave of exhaustion washed over me. Not my own exhaustion, but a deep, empathetic fatigue for the absolute prison my family had built for themselves. I looked at my mother in the front right eyes with a lace handkerchief sitting perfectly straight so her rented gown would not crease. I thought about the sheer terror that must be clawing at the inside of her stomach. She and Calvin had to wake up tomorrow morning to a reality where the music stopped playing and the credit card bills came due. They had mortgaged their home, emptied their retirement portfolios, and begged for money just to buy 6 hours of applause from people who would forget their names by next week. I thought about Jasmine walking into a marriage where she would spend every single day trying to prove she belonged. She would have to modify her voice, police her hair, and shrink her personality to remain palatable to the Thornton family. She was trading the financial anxiety of our parents' house for a gilded cage where her worth would always be conditional on her obedience. They were all trapped in a relentless, unforgiving cycle of performative excellence. The black tax is not always just about wiring money to relatives. Sometimes it is the crushing psychological tax of having to constantly prove your humanity and your status to a society that inherently undervalues you. Calvin, Brenda, and Jasmine had surrendered completely to that tax. They had let it dictate their finances, their relationships, and their entire identities. They were performing for a crowd that was actively looking down on them, smiling through the humiliation just to maintain an illusion. And then there was me. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the soft silk of my unbranded dress against my skin. I did not have to perform for anyone in this room. I did not owe a single dime to any bank creditor or family member. I did not need Beatrice Thornton to nod approvingly at my outfit. I did not need Wyatt to offer me a job to validate my intelligence. My wealth was quiet, secure, and entirely my own. True freedom is the ability to sit in the back row of a room full of people trying to outshine one another and feeling absolutely no desire to join the competition. My empire was built on data strategy and undeniable results. It was built in the dark, away from the demanding eyes of people who only valued aesthetics. I possessed the kind of power that did not require a spotlight or an audience. I was entirely self-sufficient, completely detached from their toxic ecosystem. The ceremony carried on at the front of the room. The officiant spoke at length about partnership, honesty, and building a foundation of trust. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. Wyatt and Jasmine recited their personalized vows. They promised to support each other in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer. I nearly let out a laugh at that specific line. Jasmine had absolutely no concept of what poorer actually looked like, and she was entirely unaware that her new husband's corporate career was currently resting in my designer clutch. Wyatt confidently promised to be the provider, the anchor, and the leader of their new household. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who believed his trajectory was untouchable. He believed he was the smartest, most powerful person in the room. He had no idea the ground he was standing on belonged to me. The officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife. The crowd erupted into polite, measured applause. The string quartet struck up a lively, upbeat classical piece as Wyatt and Jasmine turned to face the congregation. They walked back down the aisle, beaming for the photographer retreating backward in front of them. As they passed my row, Jasmine did not even glance in my direction. She was entirely focused on the double doors leading to the cocktail hour. Calvin and Brenda followed close behind, linking arms with Richard and Beatrice Thornton, desperately trying to physically merge their families for the cameras. I remained in my seat until the very last guest had exited the ceremony space. The room suddenly felt massive and empty, smelling strongly of wilting flowers and melted wax. I stood up, smoothed my dress one final time, and picked up my clutch. The theatrical portion of the evening had concluded. Now it was time for the reception. It was time for the speeches. It was time to hand over my wedding gift. The transition from the ceremony space to the main reception hall was a masterclass in aggressive extravagance. The room had been transformed into a glowing amber cavern, dominated by towering centerpieces of white orchids and dripping crystal. Waiters in pristine white tuxedo jackets swarmed the floor in synchronized precision, delivering plates of seared Wagyu beef and butter-poached lobster to the sea of guests. I found my designated seat at the very back of the room, sharing a small table with a few distant relatives who were too engrossed in the open bar to notice my presence. I set my designer clutch on the table right next to my water glass. The envelope inside it felt warm, practically humming with the corporate power it contained. The dinner service proceeded with the kind of forced, rigid etiquette that always accompanies artificial social integrations. I watched from the shadows as my parents picked at their expensive meals, too terrified of using the wrong fork in front of the Thornton family to actually enjoy the food they had bankrupted themselves to purchase. Calvin was sweating through his custom tuxedo, laughing too loudly at every comment Richard Thornton made. Brenda sat beside him, nodding constantly, looking like a wind-up doll running out of battery. They were paying for the entire evening, yet they acted like uninvited guests, begging for scraps of validation. As the dinner plates were cleared and the champagne flutes were refilled, for the fourth time, the ambient lighting dimmed. A single crisp spotlight hit the center of the massive head table. The room quieted down, a low murmur of anticipation rippling through the crowd. It was time for the speeches. Wyatt stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a swift, practiced motion. He took the microphone from the best man, flashing a brilliant, entirely hollow smile at the hundreds of faces turned toward him. He did not look like a man overwhelmed by the love of his new bride. He looked like a CEO addressing his shareholders after a highly profitable quarter. He started by thanking his own parents. He praised their legacy, their wealth, and the impeccable bloodline they had provided him. He spent a full 5 minutes detailing his childhood vacations and the private schools that had molded him into the man he was today. He barely mentioned Calvin and Brenda, offering them a brief condescending nod of acknowledgement for hosting the event, completely ignoring the fact that they had mortgaged their entire future to pay for the microphone he was currently holding. Then inevitably, Wyatt shifted the focus entirely to his favorite subject, himself. He puffed out his chest, leaning into the microphone with the swagger of a man who believed the world revolved around his corporate trajectory. He talked about ambition. He talked about the relentless grind of the business world, explicitly comparing his new marriage to a high-stakes corporate merger that required only high-value assets. He boasted loudly about his upcoming promotion to vice president at Apex Solutions, claiming that his unmatched intellect and ruthless work ethic were the sole reasons for his meteoric rise up the corporate ladder. "I am a man who understands the value of hard work," Wyatt announced, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. "In my world, you do not get handouts. You earn your place at the table. You either produce results, or you get left behind. That is the mentality I bring to my career, and that is the standard Jasmine and I will set for our future household." He paused, letting his words hang in the heavy air of the ballroom. He scanned the room, his eyes sweeping over the sea of faces until they landed squarely on my table in the dark back corner. A slow, cruel smirk spread across his face. He could not resist. His ego demanded a sacrifice, and I was the designated target. When Jasmine and I start a family, Wyatt continued, his tone dripping with weaponized charm, I want to make absolutely sure our children understand the value of real ambition. I want them to inherit my drive. I want them to inherit my corporate hustle. And honestly, for everyone's sake, I really hope they inherit my work ethic instead of certain other family members' endless studying habits. The punchline landed exactly as he intended. A wave of low, knowing chuckles rolled through the VIP section. Wyatt's groomsmen laughed openly, clinking their glasses together in appreciation of the subtle insult. Richard and Beatrice Thornton offered polite, amused smiles, clearly enjoying the public reminder of their family's superiority over the dead weight of mine. I shifted my gaze to my parents at the head table. Calvin let out a loud, forced laugh, actively joining in on the mockery of his own daughter, just to ensure Wyatt knew he was a good sport. Brenda quickly hid her face behind her champagne flute, her shoulders shaking with a nervous, subservient giggle. Jasmine beamed at her new husband, glowing with the pure satisfaction of seeing me publicly humiliated on her special day. They were all complicit. They were all happily participating in my degradation to buy their way into Wyatt's good graces. I sat perfectly still in the dim lighting of the back row. I did not break eye contact with Wyatt. I did not frown, and I did not look away. I simply offered him a serene, chillingly calm smile. He thought he had just delivered a fatal blow to my dignity. He thought he had successfully established his absolute dominance over the family hierarchy in front of hundreds of witnesses. I had no idea that his arrogant little speech was the exact catalyst I needed. His public boasting had perfectly set the stage for his own professional execution. I reached down and rested my hand on my designer clutch, feeling the sharp edge of the envelope through the soft leather. The time for silent observation was officially over. The applause following Wyatt's speech had barely faded into the vaulted ceiling before Calvin eagerly seized the microphone. He stood at the center of the head table, straightening his posture and adjusting his expensive unpaid-for tuxedo jacket. He waited for the room to quiet down completely, commanding the attention he so desperately craved. He began with a masterclass in sycophancy. He turned directly to the Thornton family, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of deep, unearned subservience. He spoke at length about what an absolute honor it was to blend their bloodlines. He praised Richard and Beatrice for raising a son of such magnificent caliber, practically thanking them for allowing their golden boy to grace our family with his presence. He described Wyatt as the son he had always dreamed of, having, a man of industry, vision, and corporate brilliance. The Thorntons absorbed the flattery with practiced grace, offering tight, regal smiles. Wyatt threw his arm around Jasmine, puffing his chest out even further. Brenda dabbed at her eyes with a pristine napkin, playing the overwhelmed, joyful mother to perfection. But Calvin was not finished. A simple congratulatory toast was never going to be enough for him. He needed to solidify his own narrative. He needed the Thorntons to view him as a man of principle, a wealthy patriarch who demanded excellence from his lineage. To do that, he needed to make a public sacrifice. His voice dropped an octave, adopting a somber theatrical tone. He placed his free hand over his heart. As parents, we make endless sacrifices for our children, Calvin announced, his voice vibrating with false emotion through the speakers. We nurture them, we protect them, and we fund their dreams. But there comes a time when true parenting requires difficult decisions. True love is not always soft. Sometimes true love must be tough. A heavy silence fell over the ballroom. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. I sat perfectly still in the back row, my hand resting lightly on my clutch. I knew exactly what was coming next. My father looked out across the sea of guests. His eyes deliberately bypassed the wealthy corporate associates and landed directly on my table in the shadows. Wyatt spoke earlier about the value of hard work. Calvin continued, his tone dripping with righteous authority. And he is absolutely right. For over a decade, I have fully funded my eldest daughter, Kiara's education. I have written the checks, carried the financial burden, and waited patiently for her to find her path. But a father's wealth is not a crutch, and a perpetual student cannot hide in the classroom forever. A collective, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the room. A few guests turned in their seats, straining their necks to catch a glimpse of the financial parasite Calvin was describing. So today, as we celebrate the incredible success of Jasmine and Wyatt, I am making a pledge to my family, Calvin proclaimed, raising his voice so it echoed dramatically. Today marks the official end of that dependency. As of this exact moment, I am officially cutting off Kiara's college tuition. No more bailouts. No more endless semesters. It is time for her to step out into the real world and learn how to survive without my money shielding her from reality. It breaks my heart to do it, but it is the only way she will ever learn. It was an astonishing performance. He had taken the private, unhinged threat he delivered in the hallway yesterday and weaponized it into a public declaration of his own moral superiority. He was standing in front of hundreds of people actively bleeding out from credit card debt and proudly announcing that he was severing a financial lifeline that did not actually exist. How was cutting off the imaginary tuition of a 35-year-old self-made CEO just to earn a nod of approval from a white corporate manager. Brenda placed a comforting hand on Calvin's shoulder, projecting the image of a united, resilient couple making a devastating but necessary parenting choice. Jasmine looked down, hiding a triumphant, vicious smile behind her champagne flute. Wyatt nodded approvingly, raising his glass toward his new father-in-law in a gesture of mutual respect. Calvin turned back to the center of the room, raising his own crystal flute high above his head. He looked out over the glittering, opulent ballroom, thoroughly intoxicated by his own fabricated power. To Jasmine and Wyatt he declared loudly, "To ambition, to true success, and to those who actually work for it." The room erupted into applause. Glasses clinked together in a cascading wave of celebration. The guests cheered for the beautiful couple and for the tough, principled patriarch who was not afraid to make hard choices. I did not clap. I did not avert my gaze. I watched my father drink his expensive champagne, bathing in the absolute peak of his social delusion. He had laid every single one of his cards face up on the table. He had explicitly tied his dignity, his wealth, and his reputation to my supposed failure. He had built his entire pedestal on a foundation of absolute lies, and he had just handed me the sledgehammer. The applause began to die down. Calvin handed the microphone back to the best man and took his seat, leaning over to accept a congratulatory pat on the back from Richard Thornton. The scheduled programming of the evening was technically over. The DJ was queuing up the music for the first dance. My timing had to be surgical. The spotlight was fading from the head table, the tension in the room relaxing as guests prepared to turn their attention to the dance floor. I unclasped the metal latch of my designer clutch. The sharp click was barely audible over the ambient noise of the ballroom, but to me it sounded like the chambering of a round. I slid my fingers inside and gripped the thick premium watermarked envelope. I stood up from my seat in the dark corner. I did not rush. I smoothed the front of my silk slip dress, squared my shoulders, and stepped out from the shadows into the golden ambient light of the main floor. The final act was officially underway. I moved away from table 9, my heels making a rhythmic, deliberate sound against the polished marble floor. The distance between the back of the room and the glowing epicenter of the head table was substantial, giving the hundreds of guests ample time to register my approach. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, undeniable authority of a woman who owned the ground beneath her feet. The low hum of post-speech conversation began to falter. A ripple of confusion spread through the tables nearest the aisle. Guests who had just finished applauding my father's cruel declaration now turned to stare at the very subject of his humiliation. I felt their eyes scanning my simple navy slip dress, searching for the desperate, broken student my father had just described. They found nothing of the sort. My posture was impeccably straight, my expression completely devoid of any sorrow, panic, or rage. I was entirely terrifyingly serene. As I reached the midpoint of the ballroom, the head table finally noticed the disruption. Brenda's jaw dropped, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of the silk tablecloth. Calvin half rose from his seat, his face flushing a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He likely assumed I was marching up there to beg to cause a hysterical scene, or to publicly plead for the imaginary tuition he had just dramatically revoked. Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with malicious anticipation. She was fully prepared to watch me crumble in front of her new in-laws. I reached the raised platform of the head table. The best man, A tall, broad-shouldered guy who had been holding the wireless microphone loosely at his side stepped forward to block my path. He gave me a condescending look, silently communicating that my turn to speak did not exist and I was not on the schedule. I did not ask for permission. I simply extended my hand, met his gaze with absolute unyielding executive command, and waited. The air between us crackled. His arrogant smirk faltered under the weight of my unwavering eye contact. Intimidated by a quiet confidence he could not quite compute, he surrendered the microphone into my palm and took a clumsy step back. The DJ, sensing the unauthorized deviation from the program, completely faded out the background music. The silence that slammed into the ballroom was absolute and deafening. You could have heard a single pin drop on the carpet. Hundreds of faces stared at me in breathless anticipation, bracing themselves for a family tragedy to unfold live. I brought the microphone to my lips. When I spoke, my voice was not shaky. It did not echo with the frantic desperation of an abandoned daughter. It rang through the state-of-the-art sound system, smooth, resonant, and coded in pure corporate authority. "Good evening." I began, my tone perfectly conversational and relaxed. "I know I am not on the official schedule. My father Calvin just delivered a truly unforgettable toast. He spoke passionately about the heavy burdens of financial responsibility, the harsh realities of the real world, and the importance of tough love." I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with my father. He looked like he was about to burst a blood vessel, his jaw ticking furiously. "I want to publicly thank you, Calvin." I continued, my voice steady. "Your words tonight were profoundly illuminating. You are absolutely right. A father's wealth is not a crutch, and the time for protecting people from the harsh realities of the real world is officially over." Calvin froze, clearly unsettled by my complete lack of hostility. I shifted my attention away from him and focused entirely on the groom. Wyatt was leaning back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, regarding me with a look of extreme, mocking amusement. He thought this was a pathetic attempt at saving face. He thought I was standing up here to offer a tearful apology to stay in my family's good graces. I lifted my designer clutch and unclasped it. I reached inside and withdrew the thick, premium watermarked envelope my attorney had sent me. The heavy cardstock felt substantial in my hand. I held it up so the stark, embossed corporate logo of the parent company caught the golden ambient light of the room. "Wyatt," I said, my voice projecting clearly to every corner of the silent ballroom. "During your speech, you spoke extensively about your relentless drive. You talked about your upcoming promotion to vice president at Apex Solutions. You made it incredibly clear that in your world, people must earn their place at the table based strictly on results, and that high-value assets are all that matter." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to his seat at the center of the table. Jasmine glared at me, her chest heaving with silent fury, as she realized I was commanding the entire room's attention on her wedding day. As the older sister of the bride, I realized that a standard registry gift simply would not suffice for a man of your profound corporate ambition, I stated, locking eyes with Wyatt. A blender or a set of Egyptian cotton sheets felt entirely inadequate. I wanted to give you something that perfectly aligns with your unmatched work ethic. Something that speaks directly to your professional trajectory and the actual reality of the corporate world you love so much. I extended my arm, offering the sealed envelope across the pristine white tablecloth directly to him. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. Wyatt's mocking smile remained plastered on his face. He uncrossed his arms and reached out to take the envelope, completely oblivious to the fact that the heavy paper he was about to open contained the absolute destruction of his entire professional identity. Wyatt took the envelope from my hand with a swift and arrogant snatch. He flashed a knowing, triumphant look at Jasmine, clearly believing he had just successfully bullied me into funding their extravagant catering bill. He thought this was the $15,000. He thought I had completely broken under the pressure of my father's public shaming and his own corporate intimidation. The heavy, textured paper rustled loudly in the absolute silence of the ballroom as he slid his finger under the flap and broke the seal. He pulled out the single sheet of premium cardstock. I watched his eyes scan the embossed letterhead at the top of the page. It was the distinct, unmistakable logo of the parent company that had just swallowed his employer whole. A slight frown creased his forehead, a brief flash of annoyance that I had handed him a corporate document instead of a cashier's check. Then he began to read the actual text. I stood mere inches away from him, observing the exact physiological response of a man realizing his entire reality has just been shattered. The smug, self-satisfied smirk that had been permanently glued to his face all evening completely dissolved. The blood drained from his cheeks with such speed that his skin took on an ashen, sickly hue. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His eyes darted frantically back and forth across the crisp black text, reading the same 3 paragraphs over and over again, desperately searching for a punchline that did not exist. His hands actually began to tremble, causing the heavy paper to vibrate under the stage lights. "What is it?" Jasmine hissed impatiently, leaning over his shoulder to look. "Did she bring the money or not? Give it to me." Wyatt did not hand it to her. He could not move. He was completely paralyzed. He slowly looked up from the letter, his eyes locking onto mine. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance that had defined his entire personality was gone, replaced by pure, wide-eyed terror. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the ground to hit him. "You were expecting a check, Wyatt," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the microphone, so every single person in the room could hear the shift in our dynamic. "You thought I was handing you $15,000 to pay for the food you are currently digesting. Instead, I decided to bring you a critical update regarding your corporate trajectory. Since you were so deeply concerned about my employment status this morning, I thought it was only fair to return the favor." A wave of bewildered murmurs washed over the hundreds of guests. Calvin leaned forward, his face twisting in confusion, completely unable to process why his new son-in-law looked like he was going to vomit. Beatrice and Richard Thornton sat rigidly in their chairs, sensing the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere, but entirely powerless to stop it. You see, I continued pacing slowly across the front of the head table. While my father was busy lamenting my endless tuition and apologizing for my perceived failures, he forgot to mention a few minor details, probably because I never bothered to tell him. I am not a perpetual student. I have not taken a college class in over 10 years. I graduated valedictorian from Howard University a decade ago. I hold a master's degree in data science. I let that information settle over the room. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. Calvin's jaw literally dropped. The narrative they had sold to their wealthy new in-laws was instantly exposed as a complete fabrication. But I was not finished. The academic credentials were just the appetizer. "For the last 10 years, I have not been drifting," I announced, projecting my voice with the absolute certainty of a woman who answers to no one. "I have been building a data analytics firm from the ground up. I have spent a decade securing corporate contracts, developing proprietary algorithms, and building a company that currently generates 8 figures in annual revenue. And as of yesterday morning, my firm successfully executed a massive corporate buyout." I stopped walking and stood directly in front of Wyatt. He was breathing heavily now, visibly sweating under the collar of his expensive tuxedo. "The company we just acquired is Apex Solutions," I stated clearly, dropping the name of his employer into the dead silent room like an anvil. "We bought your entire infrastructure. The document you are currently shaking holding is a formal corporate restructuring notice from your new parent company, signed by the sole founder and chief executive officer, me." The collective gasp from the Thornton family was audible. Richard Thornton half stood from his chair, his face a mask of absolute shock. Beatrice gripped her pearl necklace. Jasmine snatched the letter out of Wyatt's trembling hands, her eyes scanning the signature at the bottom of the page before staring at me in horrified disbelief. Wyatt finally managed to find his voice. It was a pathetic, breathy stammer. "Kiara," he choked out, shrinking back in his chair. "I had no idea. The things I said earlier, I was just making a joke. It was just a misunderstanding about your situation." I did not let him finish his frantic backpedaling. I leaned in close, speaking directly into the microphone, so his humiliation was broadcast to every corner of the extravagant venue. "I reviewed your vice president promotion file yesterday, Wyatt," I said, my tone completely devoid of any warmth or mercy. I read through your performance metrics, your client retention rates, and your bloated middle management salary requests. I considered your highly vocal opinions on ambition, hard work, and earning your place at the table. And as your new CEO, I made my first executive decision regarding your department. I paused, letting the absolute weight of my authority press down on his chest. I decided to decline your promotion, I declared smoothly. You are simply not a culture fit for my organization. You lack the genuine drive and the respectful temperament required for leadership in a modern corporation. You can pack up your desk on Monday morning. The mic drop was absolute. The silence in the ballroom was no longer just quiet. It was a dense, suffocating vacuum. I had just dismantled his entire career, his bruised ego, and his pathetic superiority complex in front of hundreds of people. The smug corporate director, who had offered me a minimum wage data entry job, was now officially unemployed by my direct command. The absolute devastation radiating from Wyatt was palpable. But before the reality of his unemployment could fully settle over the Thornton family, a sudden booming sound broke the silence. It was the sound of someone clapping, slow, heavy, deliberate applause echoing from the center of the head table. I shifted my gaze and found my father standing tall, his hands coming together in a rhythmic, theatrical display of pure parental pride. Calvin's survival instinct was entirely rooted in his narcissism. He had just watched his carefully constructed narrative burn to ashes, but instead of accepting defeat, his ego violently course-corrected. He plastered on a massive beaming smile, looking out at the hundreds of stunned guests, as if this public execution was exactly what he had planned all along. "That is my daughter Calvin," announced his voice projecting over the murmurs. He stepped out from behind the table, opening his arms wide in a gesture of triumphant validation. "Ladies and gentlemen, that is the brilliant mind I raised. You see, I told you all earlier that true love requires tough decisions. I told you that a father must push his children to achieve greatness. And look at what that financial backing and that relentless push has created. A chief executive officer." He turned to Richard and Beatrice Thornton, who were still staring at me in absolute horror. Calvin chuckled a rich, hearty sound that was completely disconnected from the reality of the room. "Richard, Beatrice, you must forgive our little family theatricals. Kiara and I have always had this competitive banter. When I threatened to cut off her tuition tonight, it was just a push, a test of her corporate grit. The hundreds of thousands of dollars I have poured into her education over the last decade built the very empire she stands on today. I funded the foundation so she could acquire companies like Apex. That is the return on investment a father dreams of." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his pivot was almost impressive. He was actively trying to hijack my success. He was attempting to staple his name to my 8-figure company, spinning my financial independence into a testament to his own imaginary generosity. He needed the Thorntons to believe he was the quiet billionaire backer behind my corporate takeover. I did not interrupt him. I let him talk. I let him weave a beautiful, extravagant tapestry of lies, building himself a brand new pedestal right in front of the entire ballroom. When he finally finished his monologue and smiled at me, expecting me to play along and accept his pathetic attempt at a truce, I simply raised the microphone back to my mouth. "That is a fascinating narrative, Calvin," I said, my voice cutting through his fake warmth like ice. "It is a beautifully crafted story about a wealthy, supportive patriarch funding his daughter's rise to the top of the corporate ladder. There is only one minor issue with your presentation. In data analytics, we do not rely on stories. We rely on receipts." I turned my head slightly toward the back of the ballroom and locked eyes with the DJ. I had approached his booth during the cocktail hour, handing him a flash drive and 5 crisp $100 bills with very specific instructions on when to switch the input channel. I gave him a single subtle nod. Instantly, the romantic, soft-focus slideshow of Jasmine and Wyatt's engagement photos vanished from the 2 massive projector screens flanking the head table. The screens flickered black for a fraction of a second before illuminating the ballroom with stark, glaring white light. Projected in massive, high-definition resolution for all 300 guests to see was a certified document. It was a comprehensive, heavily audited financial ledger from Howard University, officially stamped by the bursar's office. Since my father has decided to publicly claim financial credit for my corporate empire, I announced, gesturing toward the massive screens. I thought it was only fair to share the exact return on his investment with the room. I began walking the audience through the projected data, my tone clinically precise. If you direct your attention to the screens, you will see my complete tuition history from my undergraduate and graduate studies. You will notice that the balance paid by Calvin or Brenda stands at exactly $0. In fact, if you look closely at the funding sources, you will see that my entire academic career was funded by a combination of full merit scholarships, federal grants, and the direct deposits from my overnight shifts at a local logistics center. The room leaned in. Guests were squinting at the screens, their eyes widening as they read the indisputable official numbers. I signaled the DJ again. The slide transitioned to a bank statement from my early 20s. You claimed you poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into my education to build my foundation. I continued, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Yet this statement from 12 years ago shows the exact moment I was forced to take out a high-interest predatory loan just to afford groceries because you refused to co-sign a standard student apartment lease. You told me I was a financial liability. You told me I was on my own. Calvin's beaming smile had completely collapsed. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking hollow and terrified. He looked up at the massive screens projecting his absolute financial negligence, his mouth opening and closing as he failed to find a lie big enough to cover the truth. You did not build my empire, I stated, staring directly into his panicked eyes. You did not fund my foundation. You have not contributed a single dollar to my survival, let alone my success in over a decade. You used my fake tuition as a prop tonight to make yourself look like a generous benefactor to the Thornton family, while secretly harassing me via text message to pay for the catering bill you could not afford. I signaled the DJ one final time. The screen switched to a massive, perfectly clear screenshot of the text message Calvin had sent me that very morning. The aggressive demand for $15,000, ending with the threat to cut off my non-existent tuition. The collective gasp that rippled through the ballroom was authentic and completely unfiltered. The Thornton family stared at the text message projected on the wall. The harsh reality of my parents' financial ruin laid entirely bare. Richard Thornton slowly turned his head to look at Calvin, his expression transforming from polite tolerance to absolute unvarnished disgust. He realized instantly that he had been sitting across from a fraud. He realized that the lavish wedding, the ice sculptures, and the imported orchids were completely unfunded illusions. My father stood frozen in the center of the head table. The confident, booming patriarch was gone. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly exposed. He had tried to steal the credit for my life's work, and in return I had stripped away the only thing he actually cared about. His public image was completely irreversibly destroyed. The silence that followed the projection of that damning text message was heavy enough to crush bone. I kept my eyes fixed on the head table, watching the exact moment the Thornton family realized they had been completely conned. Beatrice Thornton, a woman whose entire identity was built on exclusive country club memberships and generational pedigree, actually pressed a hand to her chest, as if she were experiencing physical pain. She looked at my mother Brenda, who was now weeping into her expensive unpaid-for napkin. The look Beatrice gave her was not one of sympathy, it was absolute unadulterated revulsion. Richard Thornton did not bother with subtle social cues. He pushed his chair back so aggressively it tipped over and crashed onto the marble floor. The sharp sound made half the room jump. He stepped away from Calvin as if my father were suddenly radioactive. For months, Richard had been fed a carefully curated diet of lies about Calvin's massive investment portfolios and vast real estate holdings. Now, staring at a giant projection of my father begging his own daughter for $15,000 just to feed the wedding guests, Richard realized he had married his son into a family of broke, desperate grifters. "You do not even have the money to pay for the food on our plates," Richard stated, his voice carrying the dangerous, quiet authority of a man who was used to destroying people in boardrooms. He did not yell. He did not need to. The sheer contempt in his tone was devastating. "You sat at my table, drank my wine, and pretended to be my equal, while actively extorting your own daughter to fund this circus. This is beyond pathetic." Calvin opened his mouth, raising his hands in a frantic, placating gesture. Richard, please, you have to understand. It is a cash flow issue. My assets are tied up in illiquid trusts. It is just a temporary liquidity problem. I can explain everything. Do not speak to me, Richard snapped, turning his back on my father completely. He looked at Beatrice and gave her a single sharp nod, signaling that their association with my parents was permanently terminated. While the older generation navigated their sudden social apocalypse, I turned my attention back to the groom. Wyatt was having a complete psychological meltdown. The arrogant, chest-puffing corporate director, who had confidently offered me a minimum-wage desk job just hours earlier, was hyperventilating. His eyes darted wildly between the giant projection of my financial records, the corporate restructuring notice still shaking in his hand and my face. The absolute horror of his reality was finally processing in his mind. He had spent the last 6 months treating me like a charity case. He had thrown constant microaggressions my way, mocked my supposed lack of ambition, and publicly insulted my work ethic during his reception speech. And he had done all of it to the sole founder and chief executive officer of the company that now owned his entire career. Kiara Wyatt choked out, stumbling forward and placing his hands flat on the head table as if he needed it to stay upright. Kiara, please, you have to listen to me. The things I said, the jokes I made, it was all just family banter. I did not mean any of it. I respect you. I respect women in business. You cannot fire me over a personal misunderstanding. My entire stock option portfolio vests next quarter. We just signed the mortgage on a $2 million house. You cannot do this to me. I stepped closer, ignoring the frantic chaos surrounding us. I lowered the microphone, speaking directly to him, so only the people at the head table could hear the absolute finality in my voice. I am not firing you over a personal misunderstanding, Wyatt, I said, keeping my tone coldly professional. I am firing you because you are a liability. A man who lacks the basic observational skills to realize he is insulting the owner of his company is not a man I trust to handle my client accounts. You rely on nepotism and unearned confidence instead of actual data. You are financially reckless, as evidenced by your decision to sign a $2 million mortgage while your company was actively being acquired. I leaned in just an inch closer, making sure my words imprinted on his ego permanently. You offered me a job at the bottom of the ladder because you needed someone to look down on, I continued smoothly. So I am simply giving you the opportunity to experience the bottom of the ladder for yourself. Your severance package will be mailed to your new very expensive house on Monday morning. I highly recommend you start updating your resume tonight. Wyatt let out a pathetic, strangled sound. He looked at Jasmine desperately, hoping his new bride would jump to his defense. But Jasmine was too busy dealing with the realization that the wealthy, powerful husband she thought she had secured was now officially unemployed, and the sister she had bullied her entire life was the one who held the executioner's axe. Jasmine slammed her hands onto the table, knocking over a crystal champagne flute. The glass shattered, the sound slicing through Wyatt's pathetic whimpering. She lunged forward, her massive pearl-covered gown catching on the chairs and pulling the silk tablecloth askew. The elegant, curated princess facade completely evaporated, replaced by the raw, unhinged fury of a spoiled child, realizing her favorite toy had just been broken. "You ruined it!" she screamed, her voice cracking as it echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "You planned this. You waited until my wedding day, my perfect day, just to destroy my life, because you are a jealous, bitter spinster. You could not stand seeing me happy. You could not stand that I married into a real family while you have absolutely nobody." I looked at my younger sister, watching her face turn a blotchy, uneven shade of red. Her carefully pinned hair was unraveling, strands falling across her face as she pointed a shaking finger at me. "I did not ruin your wedding, Jasmine," I said, keeping my voice completely even. "You and our parents ruined your own lives by building them on a foundation of lies and credit card debt. You chose to marry a man based entirely on his corporate title and his family's bank account. It is not my fault that his title actually belonged to my company, and it is certainly not my fault that you have absolutely no idea how to survive without someone else subsidizing your existence." Jasmine let out a shrill, piercing scream of frustration. She grabbed a silver butter knife and hurled it across the table. It clattered uselessly onto the marble floor. Wyatt tried to grab her arm to calm her down, but she shoved him away violently. She was visibly disgusted by the very touch of the man she had sworn to love forever just 2 hours ago. He was no longer a wealthy corporate director. He was an unemployed liability, and Jasmine's conditional love had evaporated the second his paycheck vanished. Brenda finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. My mother could not handle the absolute social collapse happening in front of her. The Thornton family was actively walking away, grabbing their coats, and heading for the exits without looking back. The wealthy associates she had spent months trying to impress were shaking their heads in profound disgust. Brenda's brain short-circuited, defaulting to the only defense mechanism she knew: aggressive, relentless gaslighting. "Stop this right now," Kiara Brenda shrieked, marching around the head table and stepping directly into my path. She waved her arms frantically toward the massive projection screens. "Turn off those ridiculous screens. Everyone knows you are lying. You forged those bank statements. You hired someone to fake that text message. You are having a mental breakdown because you are 35 and alone. You have always been prone to these dramatic, hysterical episodes when you do not get your way." The sheer audacity of her lie was staggering. She was standing in a room full of highly educated professionals, attempting to claim that I had somehow hacked into a university database and forged a corporate acquisition just to win a family argument. I did not argue with her. I did not need to. The guests did the work for me. A loud collective groan of revulsion rose from the tables. A woman I recognized as one of Wyatt's aunts stood up, threw her cloth napkin onto her half-eaten steak, and looked at my mother with pure contempt. "Are you completely out of your mind?" the aunt said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "We can all read the timestamps on those emails. We all saw the text message. You are standing here actively lying to our faces while you use your own daughter as a human bank account. This is the most disgusting display I have ever witnessed." Other guests chimed in, their voices overlapping in a chorus of absolute judgment. "I cannot believe they begged her for catering money," a man at table 4 whispered loudly. Another guest scoffed, grabbing her purse. "They mortgaged their house for a sham." People were pushing their chairs back and making for the doors. The opulent fairy tale wedding had officially descended into a chaotic, deeply uncomfortable reality show. The servers had stopped pouring wine and were standing near the kitchen doors, openly staring at the meltdown. Calvin had sunk down into his chair, covering his face with his hands, utterly defeated. Brenda spun around, her eyes wide and frantic, desperately trying to find a single friendly face in the crowd. She found none. The people she had bankrupted herself to impress were looking at her like she was dirt on the bottom of their shoes. Her social standing was not just damaged, it was entirely obliterated. She covered her face with her hands, letting out a loud, theatrical sob, but nobody rushed forward to comfort her. I stood in the center of the wreckage, entirely untouched by the chaos. The screaming, the crying, the frantic backpedaling. It washed over me without leaving a single mark. I had spent my entire life absorbing their toxicity, but tonight they were finally choking on it themselves. I raised the microphone to my mouth one final time. The brief electronic hum of the audio system instantly silenced the remaining whispers in the room and cut through the frantic theatrical sobbing of my mother. Every single eye snapped back to me. "Calvin, Brenda." I spoke their first names with absolute clinical detachment. The words echoed off the vaulted ceiling, ringing with finality. "You spent 35 years telling anyone who would listen that I was an exhausting financial liability. You built your entire identity on the lie that my existence was draining your resources. You wanted so desperately to be free of my dead weight, and you wanted a rich, successful family to validate your worth." I took a slow step toward the head table and looked down at my parents. They were entirely broken, stripped of their fake wealth, their unearned arrogance, and their social standing. I knew exactly what was running through my father's calculating mind in that moment. He was already processing my newly revealed wealth. He was silently doing the math, wondering how quickly my 8-figure revenue could pay off his second mortgages, cover this disastrous catering bill, and erase the mountain of credit card debt he had accumulated. "Consider yourselves officially unburdened," I announced, ensuring my voice carried to the very back of the hall. "I will never ask you for anything, and I will never allow you to ask anything of me. You are completely on your own. Enjoy your aesthetic. I did not throw the microphone. I did not drop it to the floor for some dramatic, aggressive effect. I simply lowered my arm and placed the heavy metal device gently on the pristine white tablecloth right next to Calvin's empty champagne flute. The soft thud of the plastic casing hitting the table was the official, irrevocable end of my familial obligations, the absolute severance of the black tax. I turned my back on the head table. I did not wait for a response, and I certainly did not look back at Jasmine, who was currently slumped in her velvet chair, staring blankly at the shattered crystal and ruined silk of her perfect reception. I began my walk down the center aisle of the ballroom. The guests who had not already fled for the exits actively parted ways to let me through. They stepped aside with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror, creating a wide, clear path to the heavy oak double doors. I walked with my head held high, my posture impeccable, my silk dress flowing smoothly around my ankles. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I was not running away in tears. I was executing a highly calculated, immensely satisfying corporate departure. As I crossed the threshold of the ballroom, leaving the suffocating smell of wilting orchids and the loud echoing sounds of my family's social collapse behind me, the crisp evening air of the lobby washed over my face. I walked past the massive ice sculpture at the main entrance. The intertwined swans were already beginning to melt under the warm venue lights, the intricate, expensive details blurring into unrecognizable, sloppy shapes of dripping water. It was a perfect, poetic reflection of my parents' manufactured reality. It was an expensive illusion that could not survive the heat of the truth. I pushed through the main glass doors of the country club and stepped out under the grand portico. The valet stand was a scene of utter chaos. It was flooded with angry, embarrassed guests aggressively demanding their cars so they could escape the disaster zone. People were whispering frantically, clutching their coats, looking over their shoulders to see if the screaming match inside was going to spill out onto the driveway. But my exit was already seamlessly coordinated. A sleek, midnight black, extended wheelbase SUV glided silently up to the curb, bypassing the chaotic line of waiting guests with absolute priority. The heavily tinted windows reflected the ambient gold lighting of the club entrance. My personal driver stepped out immediately, adjusting his crisp suit jacket before opening the rear passenger door for me. "Good evening, ma'am," he said smoothly, completely unfazed by the crowd of staring country club patrons and the obvious tension radiating from the building. "I trust the event concluded on schedule." "It concluded exactly as projected," I replied, offering him a genuine, relaxed smile. "Take us home, please." I slid into the spacious, climate-controlled interior of the luxury SUV. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, instantly sealing off the noise, the drama, and the toxic energy of the outside world. I sank back into the plush leather seating and let out a long, slow, incredibly deep breath through the tinted glass. I watched the frantic activity of the country club fade away as my driver navigated us smoothly down the long, manicured driveway. The physical weight lifting off my shoulders was indescribable. For years I had carried the heavy, suffocating armor of the perpetual student just to protect my peace. I had absorbed their insults, deflected their demands, and lived in the shadows of their grand, arrogant performances. I was leaving behind a family, drowning in self-inflicted debt, a sister married to an unemployed, arrogant liability, and a father whose precious social reputation was permanently obliterated. They had spent their entire lives trying to make me feel small so they could feel giant. Tonight, the universe had simply corrected the scale. I reached into the center console, poured myself a glass of chilled, sparkling water, and opened my phone to check my corporate dashboard. The acquisition documents were fully executed. My team was ready for the integration phase. Tomorrow was Monday. I had an empire to run, a global market to dominate, and an incredibly bright, peaceful future that belonged entirely to me. 6 months have passed since I walked out of that ballroom and left my family to choke on their own manufactured reality. The integration of Apex Solutions into my parent company was a masterclass in corporate efficiency. My team moved in, trimmed the executive deadweight, optimized the software infrastructure, and increased overall profit margins by 20% in the first quarter alone. The most significant piece of dead weight we trimmed, however enthusiastically removed himself. I never actually fired Wyatt. I did not need to. I simply held him to the exact same rigorous performance metrics as every other employee in my organization. I stripped away his unlimited corporate expense account, canceled his unnecessary afternoon golf outings, and demanded actual data-driven results from his department. He lasted exactly 3 weeks. His fragile ego simply could not process the daily reality of answering to the black woman he had spent months treating like a pathetic charity case. He marched into the Human Resources Department and submitted his resignation with furious, arrogant indignation. He boldly declared to anyone who would listen that a man of his elite pedigree and corporate vision would easily secure a vice president position at a rival tech giant within the month. I was spectacularly wrong. The corporate landscape is a remarkably small ecosystem, and the news of my highly publicized acquisition had made significant waves in the industry. When hiring managers at competing firms reviewed his actual portfolio, stripped of the nepotism and unearned confidence he had previously relied on, they saw exactly what I saw. He was a bloated middle manager with absolutely no technical skills and a history of driving away top talent. Today, Wyatt is working a mid-level operations job at a regional shipping company. His salary was slashed by more than half, and he no longer holds a title that impresses anyone at a rehearsal dinner. The financial devastation for my parents was far less gradual. The invoices for the imported Thai orchids, the custom lighting packages, and the vintage champagne all came due just 30 days after the wedding. Calvin and Brenda had mortgaged their home to the absolute limit and completely drained their retirement portfolios. They had done it all operating under the delusional assumption that my 8-figure company would eventually serve as their ultimate bailout. When they finally realized my bank accounts were permanently sealed to them, their fabricated reality instantly disintegrated. They were forced to quietly list their house on the market at a significant loss just to avoid an aggressive public foreclosure. Their beloved country club membership, the cornerstone of their entire social identity, was terminated for non-payment. The most crushing blow to their vanity, however, came directly from the Thornton family. Richard and Beatrice Thornton completely severed all ties. They refused to answer Calvin's frantic pleading phone calls. They blocked Brenda on every single social platform. My parents had sacrificed their entire future and alienated their eldest daughter to buy their way into a social circle that discarded them the very second their financial fraud was exposed on a projector screen. They are currently living in a cramped rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, drowning in massive credit card debt and entirely isolated from the high society they spent decades worshipping. And then there is Jasmine. The undisputed golden child finally secured the massive diamond ring, the extravagant ceremony, and the supposedly wealthy husband she thought would elevate her above me forever. But the glittering facade cracked before she even returned from her honeymoon. She had married Wyatt purely for his status and his upward corporate trajectory. With his career entirely derailed and his income slashed, the foundation of their superficial marriage immediately crumbled. They had signed the paperwork for a $2 million house based entirely on a promotion that never materialized. Now the final notices and past due bills are piling up on their kitchen counter. Word travels fast in our old social circles, and the gossip is impossible to ignore. Jasmine and Wyatt are trapped in a deeply toxic, highly resentful marriage. Wyatt blames Jasmine's family for his absolute professional humiliation and his subsequent financial downfall. He never lets her forget that her sister is the reason he lost his kingdom. Jasmine deeply resents Wyatt for failing to provide the luxurious, effortless lifestyle she felt entirely entitled to. She has no meaningful career to fall back on, and she has no wealthy parents left to bail her out of her poor decisions. She spends her days trapped in a massive echoing house they can no longer afford to furnish, legally bound to a bitter, unemployed man she barely tolerates. She fought her entire life to be the ultimate winner in our toxic family dynamic. She stepped on me, mocked me, and demanded my money just to ensure her absolute superiority. She ultimately succeeded. She won the exact life she fought so desperately for, and it is a complete and utter nightmare. I turn my attention away from the past, and look out through the massive glass windows of my corner office. The morning sun reflects brilliantly off the downtown skyline, casting a warm, unobstructed glow across my polished desk. My assistant just placed a fresh espresso next to my quarterly projections, and the building is quiet humming with the steady productive energy of an empire running exactly as designed. For so long, I allowed myself to be cast as a secondary character in my own family's dysfunctional drama. I wore the heavy, suffocating disguise of the perpetual student because I genuinely believed that making myself small was the only way to survive the crushing expectations of the black tax. I thought that if I hid my wealth, my drive, and my achievements, I could buy my peace. But peace purchased through self-erasure is just another form of debt. It drains your spirit just as aggressively as toxic relatives drain your bank account. Looking back at that extravagant, disastrous wedding reception, observers might think that projecting those financial records and firing Wyatt was my grand revenge. They might assume the ultimate victory was watching my father's social standing evaporate or seeing my sister's superficial kingdom collapse under its own weight. But they would be completely wrong. The true revenge was not the destruction of their manufactured reality. The ultimate revenge was my departure. It was the exact moment I set that microphone down on the pristine white tablecloth, turned my back on their frantic shouting, and walked out into the cool night air without a single ounce of guilt. It was the absolute profound liberation of refusing to shrink myself, to fit into rooms that were never built to accommodate my success. I no longer have to dull my shine so my parents can feel tall. I no longer have to subsidize the delusions of people who deliberately seated me next to a restaurant kitchen. I am no longer playing a fictional role to manage their incredibly fragile egos. I am a 35-year-old self-made chief executive officer. I built a corporate powerhouse from the ground up completely on my own, relying on nothing but my own intellect, resilience, and undeniable work ethic. I took off the mask they forced me to wear, and the woman underneath is more powerful, more capable, and more at peace than they ever could have possibly imagined. My phone buzzes gently on the desk. It is a priority alert from my acquisitions team regarding our next major corporate target. I pick it up, take a slow, satisfying sip of my espresso, and smile at the glowing screen. The market is wide open. The algorithms are perfectly optimized, and for the first time in my entire life, I am living completely, unapologetically free. The black tax is officially canceled, and my personal return on investment is absolutely infinite. The most profound lesson from Kiara's journey is that your true worth is never defined by people who refuse to see your value. Familial pressures often force successful individuals to shrink themselves to accommodate fragile egos. However, true liberation does not come from revenge. It comes from establishing ironclad boundaries and unapologetically stepping into your power. You owe neither your hard-earned success nor your peace of mind to relatives who use love as a manipulative tool. Authentic family celebrates your growth instead of punishing you for it. Walking away is not giving up. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. If you have ever had to set difficult boundaries to protect your own peace and build your authentic life, share your story in the comments below, and do not forget to hit like and subscribe for more empowering narratives of resilience and triumph.